Good afternoon, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer. Hope you're all doing very well today. Let's talk about some M21 spoilers, and where better to begin than with the brand new Liliana Waker of the Dead. Now, many people have asked me about her. What about the new Liliana, Grim? Is she good enough? Will she rock? Well, I understand the appeal. She's Liliana. We all love Liliana, and if you look at the art here, she's looking very pensive. She's looking thoughtful. She's also looking like she needs a home, she wants somebody to take her under her wing. Will that be you? Can you be the one to save her? Well, you do whatever you want, right? But I'm here to advise against it. No, I do not think she will rock. I do not think she's strong enough to be included in an optimized BGX Modern 75, and we'll get into exactly why. We'll break the card down, so hate to dash your hopes and dreams, my friends, but that's my take on it, and let's jump right in. Thank you so much to all Patreon supporters, and thank you as well just for watching. Alright, so she's a 4-drop, that's the first big red flag, and you know what, we can play 4-drops, so we're BGX, we're mid-range, we take the game long, but it's a 4-drop. Admittedly, the casting cost of double black is no problem, but only for loyalty. We've seen beefier planeswalkers in the recent past, to say the least, right? And her +1 is also only a +1. In other words, she is not getting big anytime soon in terms of her loyalty. So overall, this is a very fragile piece relative to what we would prefer. She does not have a lot of natural resilience to being attacked off the field or burned off the field or anything like that, right? So something to note, but, admittedly, those stats are not typically what define a walker. Of course, the abilities generally define the threshold of a walker's playability. So the +1 is naturally where we need to begin. +1, each player discards a card. Each opponent who can't loses 3 life. So many have said, well, this fits right into the BGX attrition plan, doesn't it? And yes, nominally speaking, it does. Theoretically speaking, it does. Maybe you remember this and maybe you don't. I actually made the case right from day one that Kroxa was definitely strong enough to Jund. I thought the card was awesome from the word go, and a big reason for that, even though many people at the time were saying, you pay 2 mana to force the opponent into a non-targeted discard, that's not playable, that's terrible. But the principle is that Kroxa's attrition adds up and has exponential returns when paired with your targeted discard and with your Liliana of the Veil +1. And of course, Kroxa has other upsides too. Liliana's ability here, each opponent who can't loses 3 life, that has a similar similar energy to the Kroxa life loss as well, right? But the big difference, and this is a huge one, you can even draw an equivocation between the fact that Kroxa is recursive and Liliana is a planeswalker, so she leaves the body behind. I would dare say that Kroxa's presence when escaped is much stronger than a planeswalker, all else being equal. But even if we want to say those are roughly equivalent, there is still one glaring difference. So resource denial, like I said, and specifically attrition of the opposing hand, gets exponentially stronger when it's overloaded. Up to a point, admittedly. If they're out of cards, then your discard's no longer a good draw, for the most part. But it also reaches diminishing returns if it's late. If it shows up later than it should, if it comes as a top deck when the game has already virtually been decided, it's very, very bad. So in other words, if you compare it to resource generation, which is kind of universally good, a card like Icefang Quattle is a good turn 2 play, but it's also a great turn 15 play. If you're behind and hellbent and desperate, it's a good top deck. Or if you're in a commanding position on that turn 15, it's also a very fine play, right? But something that is resource denial oriented gets worse and worse and worse the further and further and further it goes from being deployed on curve. And that is the big difference between something like Kroxa, which can be part of a crushingly effective curve outgoing turn 1 Thoughtseize, turn 2 Kroxa, turn 3 Liliana, and Liliana Waker of the Dead, which is like, okay, I'm going to do something that's good in context but underwhelming on its own on turn 4. That's way worse than doing it on turn 2. And hey, even if you draw your Kroxa on turn 4 and you're casting it from hand on turn 4, at least that opens up the opportunity to double spell, right? And you also don't have a fail rate when you're just trying trying to curve your disruption along 1, 2, and 3, like you do when you're trying to play a purely resource denial piece here on turn 4. You just simply have the fail rate of not drawing your 4th land, and that becomes a disaster in its own right, because again, the theory here, my friends, is that resource denial needs to happen early. Has to happen early, or it's just not an effective thing to do in Modern. So, even though, again, the +1, yes, it's nominally a good fit, yes, it's theoretically a good fit, in practice, I'm very, very skeptical of it, simply because she is a 4-drop, and as a 4-drop, we need to be starting to 2-for-1 the opponent in a really impactful way, or take over the game in some other way. Now, you might say, well, the -3 is how you 2-for-1 the opponent. Yes, you can. Let's get into it. So listen, this -3 is great in a lot of ways. It's removal. On BGX, we love removal. Hey, it's even a -X effect, and that's great because we can struggle with indestructible threats, and this is definitely a way to get around that. So there's much to like about it, but here is the big problem. Again, we're dealing with a 4-drop. If we're tapping out for a relatively fragile 4-drop Planeswalker, and indeed, even including this 4-drop in our deck over things like Bloodbraid Elf, or maybe arbitrarily raising our curve and giving ourselves a weaker early game to include things like this, well, you better make sure it's going to be really effective. And the -3, number one, it does leave the Liliana down at 1. Again, that's pretty fragile, but more importantly, it is conditional. Most of the time on BGX, if left to our own devices, we will fill our graveyards up relatively well, but we are not actively committing to that. We're not playing cards that, nothing like Grizzly Salvage or something that's specifically designed to fill up the graveyard. It's just like, as a matter of course, when we interact and when we trade resources, the graveyards grow. So most of the time, yeah, we will fill up our graveyard enough to make this -3 effective, but that is far from a guarantee. If you compare it to other 4-mana Planeswalkers with minus abilities that are removal, they are far less conditional than that, and that is even before we consider the concept of graveyard hate. I'll talk a little bit more about both of those things, alternative Planeswalkers and the prospect of graveyard hate, in a little bit, but before we leave this card, let's touch on the alt quickly. You know, it's not really usually correct to put too much stock in the alt when you're evaluating a Planeswalker, because if you're alting a Planeswalker, you're probably in a really good spot, and most alts are definitely very, very strong, no matter what they are. So bear that in mind. However, we do have to at least touch on it here. Liliana, Waker of the Dead's -7. You get an emblem with, at the beginning of combat on your turn, put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. It gains haste. So everybody can imagine the situation where you're in a grindy mirror match and your opponents have spend a lot of time and resources removing your creatures, and you take over the game with Liliana and eventually get to ult her, and then, yeah, every turn you're bringing back a hasty threat from your graveyard. Obviously, that's really good, but honestly, I don't rate this alt highly at all compared to other alts. It is far too conditional. Again, we're talking about things that need to happen after you've already gotten your 4-drop Planeswalker to take over the game long enough to ultimate. You still have the opponents, and they need to be on a deck that's removing your creatures, you know? What if they're not? What if they're not? This happens. Or if they are, what if graveyard hate has been involved, right? It is just actually pretty underwhelming for an alt. And again, we can't really judge the alt too heavily, rather can't really weigh the alt too heavily in the overall judgment of the card, but for what it's worth, I think this alt is pretty weak. Now let's talk about grave hate, and let's also talk about alternative Planeswalkers for the role that Liliana, Waker of the Dead would otherwise occupy. Alright, graveyard hate first, guys, and we have all been there where it's like, alright, you know, let's use this example, even though it's a little bit outdated. Before the snow descended upon everything that we know, back when blue-white control that wasn't snow was a major thing, we've all been in those situations where the opponent has rest in peace. And some of the time, They play a turn 2 Rest in Peace, and you just smile because your progression does not care whatsoever about Rest in Peace. You've got an unchecked Dark Confidant into Liliana of the Veil. The opponent time walked themselves on turn 2 and went down a card in the face of your card advantage and aggressive attrition, and everything you're doing is just gold, and it doesn't care in the least about a hard graveyard hate piece like Rest in Peace. However, we've also all been on the opposite end of that spectrum, where you're kind of like in a weird position where maybe you have a discard spell, maybe you're sitting on a removal spell in case they have a Planeswalker, but really, you're on the Tarmogoyf plan, and they land turn 2 Rest in Peace, and you don't have an out for it, and you're just like, well, I guess I'm kind of doing nothing and hoping for the best, and you're against blue-white control, so the best is never really going to come your way. They never don't have it, right? So, the point here is that Graveyard Hate is a very interesting prospect against us from the opponent's perspective. Sometimes it will be correct to bring it in, and they'll do so. Sometimes it will not actually be optimal, and they'll do it anyway. Either way, you do have to be prepared for it, and that question is very interesting in its own right. It depends on the texture of our list, what they've seen of it, what they know of it, the texture of their own list, how much graveyard dependency their own deck might have, so on and so forth. And of course, blue-white control is just one of many archetypes that could theoretically bring cards like this in against us. But, you think of Rest in Peace and Leyline of the Void shutting off a lot of our stuff, or making it worse at least. You think of Nile Spellbomb and Relic of Progenitus, the so-called soft graveyard hate pieces. They're actually usually better against us because even if we have a progression that ignores it, they can just cash it in and, it replaces itself, and they maybe set back some of our future draws a little bit that way. But the worst case scenario is when it's both, like when we're graveyard dependent and they have a really dominating relic or a really well-timed spellbomb activation that really screws us and they get to draw a card off it. All of these things can happen. Any experienced BGX player has been there. The point is, we have to think very carefully before we commit to something that makes us further vulnerable than we already have to be to graveyard hate. I mentioned Kroxa at the beginning of this video. Kroxa makes Jund more vulnerable to graveyard hate for sure. Is it worth it? In my view, yes. Is Liliana Waker of the Dead compared to alternatives worth making you that much more vulnerable to graveyard hate? In my view, no. Just something to think about. It's a deck building principle to keep in the back of your mind. Maybe you use it as a tiebreaker if you're not sure. Alright guys, well, what are some of the alternatives I'm talking about? Well, you're looking at them. I think these 4 cards overall, not only are they all less vulnerable to graveyard hate than Liliana Waker of the Dead, which as I mentioned is a nice kind of tiebreaker, I think even if that wasn't a concern, like if they banned all graveyard hate tomorrow, I think honestly these cards might be stronger than her, holistically speaking anyway. But let's talk about, I guess start in the top right, go counterclockwise, Vraska Golgari Queen first, because she's a 4-drop, and like Liliana Waker of the Dead, she can be played in any BGX deck. Well, the thing that I like about Vraska, as I mentioned, I think the later in the game your card is designed to be played, or even can be played legally, because remember, we're not ramping here, we're not getting our 4-drops out ahead of curve until Deathrite Shaman's unbanned. So the later your card's going to come down, the more resource generating you want it to be. Vraska Golgari Queen, her plus is a +2, so she protects herself better, and it's resource generating. Now, she's not without her resource denial capacity either. Her -3, of course, is an Abrupt Decay on a stick. Overall, not strictly better, of course, than Liliana Waker of the Dead's -3, but certainly more flexible overall. It cannot kill creatures CMC 4+. Beyond that, it's better at killing small creatures, it's better at, and indestructible stuff it's not also good against, right? And it can kill any other permanent, though, so overall I rate it more highly, and Vraska's ult is just better than Liliana's for me. You're making it so that there's no graveyard dependency here, and whenever anything connects, the game is over. And next up, we've got Gideon, ally of Zendikar, admittedly one that's a little bit different from the traditional BGX spread, and rightfully so, because he is a mono-white card. He's not really any kind of a resource denial card, but Abzan lists often opt for him as a one-of value generator in the side, and the reason that's interesting to note is because the Abzan lists could play Vraska, or they could play Liliana the Last Hope, or they could play any number of grindy cards, but it just goes to show you that value generation out of Planeswalkers is very, very important, and Liliana of the Veil is arguably the only exception to this. Every other modern playable Planeswalker that I can think of has extreme properties of value generation, and Gideon, ally of Zendikar, is probably the best example that sees regular BGX play. And Chandra Torch of Defiance is an option you'll occasionally see a Jund player reach for, and this is a very interesting comparison because the -3 is very similar, but overall I would rather have Chandra's. It is just far less conditional, even though it has a lower ceiling than Liliana, Waker of the Deads, of course. Chandra, again, can't kill indestructible things, and sometimes Liliana can kill things of toughness 5 or higher, whereas Chandra cannot. But beyond that, again, overall I think the -3 stronger, and the +1, the ability to ramp, or the ability to get value generation that can also translate into a shock. Chandra is extraordinarily flexible and versatile, which you want a one-of value 4-drop to be. And again, this -7, just like Vraska's, to me, this is way more deterministic, way less conditional, and way stronger overall than Liliana, Waker of the Dead's ult. Finally, Liliana the Last Hope, I think if she's even comparable, which she is, then she's just stronger, of course, because she only costs 3 mana, and that's incredible. Her +1 can be really oppressive, especially on the play against a deck with a lot of X1s. Her -2, admittedly, is mostly shut off by Graveyard Hate, or at least rendered a lot less effective by Graveyard Hate, but that is the only thing that's shut off by it. Crucially, you can just, even in the face of a Rest in Peace, simply start +1ing her, and now the opponent has just, 4 turns to deal with her before you're ready to ult, and the ult, again, way more deterministic, way more of an unbeatable win condition, and certainly not vulnerable to Graveyard Hate compared to what we're looking at out of the 4-mana Lily. So there you go, guys. I've made the case against Liliana, Waker of the Dead, but I did put that asterisk behind that in the beginning. Let me just address that now. So the nature of the card type Planeswalker, to me, a lot of them have a similar structure, a lot of them are inherently an X for 1, and a lot of them will do great deeds for you if you're already in a position to deploy them and protect them and all the rest. In other words, if you're already even or ahead and you find a good spot for them, they will continue pulling you further ahead in a way that most other card types, just like as a whole, cannot. Therefore, you have more wiggle room. If you want to get spicy with your fun-ofs, with the Planeswalker slots in your deck, you have a little bit more liberty to do so without straying too far from optimization than you do with creatures, or with instants or sorceries, or basically anything else, as far as I would say. So if you do want to play Liliana, Waker of the Dead, do know that, she still might be just about as good as like a Chandra or a Vraska would be. I went over the differences, but there is that asterisk that, Planeswalkers will kind of always, they're all a little samey, especially when they're 4-drops that follow a similar structure. So again, if you're really committed to Liliana Tribal, there are worse things you could do than play her as a one-of. But overall, I have to say, no, she will not rock. She does not make the cut for me in an optimized list. But as always, my friends, if you disagree, or if you do agree, please do let me know in the comments below. My mind is open. I'm waiting to hear your hot take. So thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think about this and about M21 as a whole, and I will talk to you soon. I hope everybody out there has a wonderful day.